New York's gun carry law faces another setback in federal court. Plus, Cam Edwards of Bearing Arms on the impact of the election on gun policy. That and more on this episode of the Weekly Reload podcast.
I made the devil run. I gave him poison just for fun. I had one friend.
All right, ladies and gentlemen, welcome to another episode of the Weekly Reload podcast. I'm your host, Stephen Gutowski. I'm also the founder of thereload.com, where you can head over and sign up for our free weekly newsletter today if you want to keep up to date on the latest in guns in America. And you can also buy a membership if you want to go a bit more in depth and get exclusive access to hundreds of pieces of analysis that will really help you stay informed about what's happening across the country with gun politics. But this week, we have an election to talk about. We have sort of the results. We have most of the results in, and I'm bringing back on Cam Edwards from Bearing Arms, one of my favorite guests, who was on to talk about what we should look for ahead of the election, and now is back to tell us what we've seen out of the election. How are you doing today, Cam?
I'm good, Stephen. How are you, sir?
I'm doing well. I'm still waiting on Arizona and Nevada and Oregon to get their acts together and let us know who won these races. Happens every election with some of these states. They should maybe, send some people to Florida and figure out how to count votes a little faster.
Right.
But we do have the bulk of the major results in, and there's probably a few things we can take from them. Why don't we start with just the top line? What was your big takeaway from Tuesday's elections from the results we've seen?
You know, I thought it was a better night for gun owners than for the GOP more generally, both from how some of these races turned out and then just, where we're going to stand, I think, after all of the other races have been called. The red wave was there, but it wasn't equally applied in every state. I remember the last time I was on, I remember you and I talking about New York and trying to, I think you or I, maybe both of us, sort of compared New York to Virginia last year and, wondered, okay, well, would there be enough of a red wave to, unseat Kathy Hochul? I mean, look, New York's a lot bluer than Virginia is. And so the answer was no. But in a state where Andrew Cuomo won by 22 points 4 years ago, Kathy Hochul is going to win by like 6. So there was, we've saw, I think, 3 Democrats from New York's congressional delegation were defeated. So we did see some down ticket, I think, wins for gun owners. And again, a lot of those places, a lot of those districts were upstate New York, Long Island. Places where, I think you've got a lot of people who are really ticked off about the Concealed Carry Improvement Act, quote unquote, in the attempt to go after their right to keep and bear arms. I don't think it was the only issue, obviously, but I think it was an issue that hurt Hochul in New York. Well, let's just go over the top lines real quick, right?
Yeah. What we know now, right? Because I do want to get into some of the how do we judge these outcomes based off what the expectations were? Because I think that's a really important extra step you got to take when you're looking at election results, right? Like you're talking about here with Hochul. But first off, it seems this hasn't been called yet as of Friday when we're talking about this, but it seems very likely that Republicans will take control of the House, but not by a very wide margin. And it's now with the call in the Arizona Senate race, it's clear that Republicans will not take control of the Senate. They could still get to another 50-50 split, depending on how Nevada goes and the Georgia runoff ends up. But they won't have control of that body. And then you had a number of these key races that we talked about before the election. So New York obviously got Hochul held on to win, but only by a thin margin. You had Beto lose tremendous, by 11 points in Texas to Abbott. And then you had Kemp defeat Abrams again, but by, I think that was about 9 points in Georgia, which is significant as well because Georgia is more of a purple state. There's 2 Democratic senators and the Democrat running for re-election right now is ahead of the Republican. Warnock's ahead of Walker even though they're going to runoff. So that's perhaps the most impressive win of those three, would you say?
Yeah, I think so. Although I think they were all, impressive because of the margins that we saw. Right.
Mm-hmm.
And this is something that I think you and I both talked about in our post-election analysis, is that, Democrats ran this message that constitutional carry was extreme. Right. That was sort of one of their issues, along with abortion, was constitutional carry in these states. And I think what we saw is that constitutional carry is not nearly as controversial as the gun control lobby would like it to be, because 9 governors who signed constitutional carry into law were on the ballot on Tuesday.
And they all won, right?
And they all won. And I don't even think it was close. I think Kemp's race might have been the closest.
Because Abbott and Kemp both signed it as well.
Right. And so, this was supposed to be the election cycle, according to Peter Ambler of Giffords, where Democrats, showed that they could win on gun control. And I just don't think that that's the case. Because, again, when you look at, first of all, what issues were most important to voters, gun control was behind, inflation, was behind abortion. It was tied, I believe, with crime. And not everybody who thinks about or considers gun policy to be their most important issue is going to side with gun control, right? There are going to be a lot of, Second Amendment supporters who say this is my number one issue, but that's not a vote for an anti-gun agenda. And I'm looking around. I mean, look, we can talk about Colorado 3 with Lauren Boebert. But
which we should, yeah.
I'm trying to find that race or campaign that says that allows the gun control lobby to say, look, this proves that, we've got a winning message and Americans side with us. I don't think that's what this midterm showed. But as you pointed out in your commentary, I don't think that this was a resounding enough election night for Second Amendment advocates that it's really going to cause Democrats to reevaluate the relationship with the gun control lobby. I think it's still going to be full steam ahead going forward.
Yeah. Yeah, I think that's probably a good overall takeaway, right? You have what are generally bad results for Republicans when you're thinking about the expectations, right? We can talk maybe later about some of the practical implications of the election, because that's important too. But when you're looking at just the political implications of it, retaking the House was expected, and Republicans, it seems, have managed to do that. But what was also expected is that they would do it by a pretty wide margin, and that hasn't come to pass. And there were a lot of people thinking they might get 53 or 54 even seats in the Senate, and they might not even get back to 50 at this point. With how the election actually turned out, they're going to be lucky to get back to 50. And it'll take another runoff in Georgia for them to do that. And this time they'd have to win that runoff. But and you look at the NRA spending versus the gun control group spending. And right now it sure seems, the NRA's goal seemed to absolutely be taking control of the Senate. They spent a lot of their money, the vast majority of their money, in those 6 key battleground races in the Senate. And it looks like they're going to come out with a losing record in those battles. They won in Wisconsin, they won in North Carolina, but those are 2 holds. First of all, it's not a pickup.
Right.
But they lost in Pennsylvania, where they were spending a lot of money. They lost in Arizona, where they're spending a lot of money. They lost Georgia's going to a runoff with the Democrat ahead in the vote, the initial vote. And then Nevada is still a toss-up at this point. I think Laxlet is leading by a very thin margin, and nobody has called that race yet. So it could still go either way. But that's a bad night for Republicans. And because the issues become very polarized among the political parties, that equals a bad night for the NRA and gun rights advocates generally. But when you zoom into the races where this was an actual top issue, you see a different picture, right? Is that fair?
Yeah, I think that's fair. And I don't know how many people beyond NRA or Everytown employees actually, are going to remember who endorsed what candidate and who had the winning record. But I also think, of all of those candidates that you just talked about and all those races where the NRA spent in Pennsylvania and in Georgia and in Arizona, one of the big issues was candidate quality. Right. And in every one of those states in the Republican primary, there were candidates on the ballot who were just as strong in the Second Amendment, who I think would have been stronger in the general election. And a lot of these candidates were the candidates that Democrats spent money trying to promote. They knew that these were going to be the weaker candidates in the general election. And unfortunately, they were right. So I don't know that this says as much about, the NRA's diminished power or, a changing of the attitudes in these states in terms of our right to keep and bear arms. As you say, guns weren't the primary issue in any of these races. In Arizona, Mark Kelly didn't want to. I don't think he brought up gun control once, which is amazing, given that, he co-founded Giffords with his wife. Right. But I mean, he did not want that to be an issue. I wonder if Blake Masters would have performed better had he tried to make it more of an issue as he did in the primary. But I don't know. I think, though, what this really shows, when you look at the Senate, especially, I'm hopeful that we are going to take the House and we'll have that firewall. But again, I don't think that anything really changes here. I think the gun control lobby is going to be able to point to those races that you just did, and they're going to be able to say, look, this does show that there are changing attitudes in these red states, and it doesn't hurt you to run on gun control. The question is, though, if you've got a divided Congress, does that really matter, at least for the next 2 years? Or will, the gun control lobby instead be looking more at the executive branch for trying to enact their agenda? But I don't think that you could. I think we're roughly a 50-50 country when it comes to the issue of gun control. And I think this was roughly a 50-50 election. Although I still think that there are signs that that opposition to gun control is becoming perhaps a more bipartisan issue than anti-gun activists would like.
Yeah, let's talk about some of the signs of that real quick, because I think, as we discussed in our previous podcast, in our pre-election podcast, the ballot initiatives are probably the easiest ones to read as far as what they mean for how Americans feel about gun politics, or at least how Oregonians and Iowans feel about gun control, right? Because those are the two states that had initiatives. But you had the Iowa pro-gun initiative where they added the right to keep and bear arms to their state constitution, and they declared it an individual right, and they said that judges would have to use strict scrutiny anytime they consider a gun case moving forward. That initiative got 65% of the vote. It ran well ahead of both the Republican governor who won and the longtime Republican senator Chuck Grassley, who won re-election as well. So that implies that a lot of Democrats in the state crossed over to vote for that ballot initiative. And the Oregon initiative, which has not been called yet, and is, I don't know, we don't want to speculate too much on what's going. Maybe it will pass, but the margin right now, I believe, is 50.9% for and 49.1% against. So it's obviously extremely tight. And you still see, if you look at the raw numbers right now, that the same effect happened there. You had more people vote for the Democratic senator who was up for re-election than voted for the ballot initiative. And the governor's race there was a little weird because it was a three-way race with Democrat turned independent who took like 10% of the vote. And so if you combine the two Democrats, basically, they got more votes than the ballot initiative got. Although the Democrat who won got fewer votes, but she didn't have to get to 50% to win because of the split race. So, again, I think what you see there is that there must have been a significant number of Democrats who crossed over to vote against that initiative, which puts in place a permit to purchase requirement and confiscation of magazines that hold more than 10 rounds and a few other things. So there appears to have been, in these ballot initiatives, significant crossover votes for the pro-gun position in these races.
Yeah, and I want to start with Oregon because to me that's the more interesting of the two. Like, hey, we expected the Iowa amendment to pass. I don't think I thought it'd be closer to 20 points than 30 points, but I think Oregon is one of the great what ifs of this cycle. What if gun owners have been able to put as much money into a public opinion campaign against Measure 114 as supporters were able to put into, their spending? Gun owners were outspent by about 10 to 1 in this race. And as I wrote a story about this for Bearing Arms, the top five donors in favor of the ballot measure were all from out of state. They were either gun control groups or they were, wealthy anti-gun philanthropists from the Seattle area. So there was a lot of out of state money funding this gun control initiative. And there were Democrats in Oregon who voted against Measure 114. And they weren't just rural Democrats. There were some Portlandiers, I guess, who voted against this measure. And I can't help but wonder, like, what would have happened if we had been able to spend a couple of $1 million in Portland, in these suburbs, targeting liberals and pointing out, the disparate harm that's going to be caused by this magazine ban. Do you really want to put a new nonviolent criminal offense on the books when you guys have been when we have been advocating for criminal justice reform for the last 2 years? This takes us away from where we've been wanting to go. If there had been that sort of sustained campaign that could have brought down support in Portland from, let's say, 75% to 70% or 66%, we might be looking at the defeat of Measure 114. And, one of the lessons that I think Second Amendment advocates need to take going forward is that the pro-gun left might be small, but they're there. And when you see these types of anti-gun initiatives run in states like Oregon, we need to figure out a way, I think, to work together. And in some cases, we might just need to figure out a way to support our, liberal gun owning friends financially or otherwise to help them get the message out to their communities. Because in this, politically tribal time, I don't know that a liberal gun owner is really going to listen even to me, right? But they might listen to another progressive gun owner. So if we can start to bolster the pro-gun owning Democrat or the pro-gun owning liberal, I think that's going to be a huge benefit to gun owners, all across the country. And I think what we saw with Measure 114 in Oregon shows that we really do need to take that section of American gun ownership seriously as a political component as well.
Yeah, I think that's a really good observation as part of the takeaway here. I would also say that even if we assume that this is going to hold on and pass by 1%, 1.5%, 2%, whatever it ends up being, it's a very small margin in a state like Oregon, which is very deep blue. I think that says a lot in and of itself. I mean, it probably means you're not going to see this sort of effort made in any other state that's even slightly less blue than Oregon. And there aren't a lot of states that are more blue than Oregon. So I think that's one significant takeaway. I also want to talk about maybe we get into some of the practical lessons from the election here. Like, what does all this mean? We've gone through some of the political stuff. And I also think that, Beto O'Rourke losing by such a wide margin is another political takeaway, because he's the best known gun control advocate running this cycle. Like, that was a huge part of his brand and has been since he called for the confiscation of AR-15s and AK-47s during the presidential primary, something that he flip-flopped on a bit in this race, but ultimately held to. And he lost by 11 points. That's less than what the last Democrat to run for governor lost by, but it's way more than he lost by against Ted Cruz when he ran for Senate, because he only lost by like 2.5 points in that race, I believe. So I think that says a lot in of itself. And running against Abbott, who had just signed, as you mentioned earlier, permitless gun carries. There's a huge stark contrast there in a state that had perhaps the worst mass shooting in American history, or one of them at least, in Uvalde.
Well, and Uvalde County went for Greg Abbott. Mm-hmm. And in fact, the margin for Abbott in Uvalde County was actually higher than what he won by statewide. And I think that is really important because, Stephen, I mean, as you're well aware, we saw, particularly in the last month or so before the election, we saw a lot of news stories about, the parents in Uvalde rallying to Beto's side, urging Abbott to pass gun laws. The community is behind Beto. The community comes out. And you really were left with this impression that, Uvalde was going to go for Robert Francis O'Rourke, right? And that there was sort of this unanimity of opinion in Uvalde that, well, we may be gun owners, but by God, we're in favor of these common sense restrictions. And as it turns out, no, that actually isn't what is going on in Uvalde. That those people exist, but they're not representative of the entire community. And I think the media, look, all of us, I think, can, probably look in the mirror and say, well, we kind of blew that. I mean, I relied too much on the Trafalgar polls and thought, there was evidence of a red wave. So nobody got it perfect. But as long as we're doing these election postmortems and we're looking in the mirror and saying, all right, well, here's where I screwed up. I want the Texas media to look in the mirror and say, here's where I screwed up. I assumed that because the people I were talking to in Uvalde felt like I feel about gun control, that everybody in Uvalde felt that way. And the answer simply is that that's not the case. And, one of the arguments that we saw before the election, and we'll probably hear it after, going forward as well, from people like Poe Murray and Shannon Watts, is that if you don't support a gun ban, then you don't care about school children being murdered, right? And I think we saw a majority of Uvalde County voters say that they were in favor of a gun ban. But that doesn't mean that they don't care about what happened in their community. It doesn't mean that they don't care about what happened in some cases to their family members or to their friends' family members. It means that they don't think gun control is the answer to preventing these types of tragedies going forward. And, that I think is what was missing from a lot of the pre-election coverage of Uvalde, is that point of view just wasn't represented, and it certainly wasn't seen as legitimate. And I know that the gun control lobby doesn't want it to be a legitimate point of view. But again, as we saw at ground zero to one of the most horrific tragedies in this country, there was a rejection of the idea that we can ban our way to safety. And I think that's important. And I think that matters. Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. And on the other side of that coin, as you mentioned briefly earlier, Boebert in Colorado would be somebody who has a very strong brand as a gun rights advocate, although a very specific brand as like a hardcore MAGA,
a firebrand, if you will.
Yeah, right. Like she certainly has associated herself very closely with like Marjorie Taylor Greene and former President Trump, and so even if she holds on to win there, the fact that it was close in a district as red as hers is a bad sign as well for at least her. I think that Beto's got a very, I don't know that a lot of people are going to be copying his brand of gun control advocacy after this. The
right.
Hell yes, we're coming for your guns thing. I highly doubt that anyone in a remotely competitive race is going to be copying his approach after this, beat down at the polls. And, perhaps the same effect will happen with Boebert and her brand of gun rights advocacy. I don't know. It's not as stark, perhaps, as what happened to Beto, but it's certainly not. The people didn't expect her to be in a close race in that district, and she is. So how much that's the MAGA stuff, how much that's the gun stuff, or how much you can even separate the two at this point with her brand is, I think, an open question. You see, is that going to be replicated going forward? Are people going to shy away from that approach?
Right. I think it probably is more the MAGA stuff than the gun stuff. Adam Frisch did not run on a pro-gun control platform. His campaign his campaign website doesn't mention gun control. The only comments that I could find from Frisch on guns came before the Democratic primary. And he said that he was in favor of the bipartisan deal that the Senate had reached, and that he felt like there could be some common sense gun safety measures that he could work on if he was elected. I have no doubt that Adam Frisch, if he wins this race, will be a reliable vote for gun control. But I don't think that the voters of Colorado's 3rd congressional district all of a sudden decided, you know what, we don't like guns after all. I think that this was a case of Lauren Boebert was not necessarily the person in Congress that they thought that they were electing. And I again, I'm not in that district. So I don't know all of the, on the ground ins and outs, but I have a feeling that they may have, a number of voters may have just felt like all of the, personality conflicts, all of the hyperbole, all of the political bomb throwing was just sort of a distraction. And she certainly raised her profile, but at the same time, she made a lot of enemies. And so do you want your congressperson to be that lightning rod?
And that district's red, but it's not like.
And that's the thing, right? Maybe you can get away with it in an R+20 district, but it may be tougher to do in a blue state like Colorado instead of a red state like Georgia for Marjorie Taylor Greene. Yeah. In a blue state, a red district of, again, I think it was supposed to be like R+9. Mm-hmm. That's a little bit tougher to do, I think. And so I don't think it was her attitude towards the right to keep and bear arms, but I think it might have been her overall attitude when she got to Washington, D.C. that, started ramping up some of the criticism there in her district. And again, this was it was not a uniform red wave. As I said earlier, there were some states that actually saw a bit of a blue wave, and Colorado was one of them. Mm-hmm. And so, that I think had an impact. The statewide elections had an impact on what happened in Colorado 3 as well.
Yeah. And maybe the lesson there is less about whether people replicate Boebert and more about whether they'll try to replicate Frisch. Maybe the Democrats will try to run people who are at least more moderate presenting than in those sorts of districts going forward, since he had much more success than people expected. Politics is I don't know that anything's super cut and dry. You could look at another example would be Fitzpatrick and I hope I don't know. I'm probably going to butcher this, but Suler in I've ruined it, but the Democrat in Texas who voted against the assault weapons ban.
Cuellar?
Yeah, if that's how you pronounce it. Hopefully. Either way, he won and Fitzpatrick won, who's the Republican, one of the Republicans who voted for the assault weapons ban. And so it's not, you can look at those and it's obviously you're not going to have, reading this stuff is never going to give you a absolutely perfect everything lined up exactly to point to this single conclusion, and there were no exceptions. This election, I think, was probably a little more muddled than some other ones, but so everything can be taken with a bit of a grain of salt. I think there are some conclusions there that we just went through that make a lot of sense. But I want to move on to the practical side because I detoured us twice there from it. Let's go back to the Oregon initiative. If that does pass and goes into effect, actually, let me start with Congress, right?
Mm-hmm.
If Republicans hold the House, that practically doesn't, like, all this political stuff you talk about until, the cows come home, or the goats, or the pigs, or whatever you guys have down there on that 40 acres. But what really matters is how this is going to play out for legislation, right?
Mm-hmm.
Seems like a good day for gun rights advocates then at the national level if Republicans take control of the House. Is that simple enough conclusion?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, again, just looking at it from a pragmatic perspective, it really doesn't matter if the majority is, 5 votes or 50, as long as the votes are there to block any gun control legislation, as long as the Republican leadership, is going to prevent any legislation from getting to the floor. So as long as you've got control of one chamber, I think you can stop the bad bills from moving forward. But it also allows you, an oversight footprint. And so, now the House Oversight Committee can start shining the light on what's going on with the ATF, which I think is going to be pretty important over the next couple of years. If the Republicans have control of the House, I think we've got a bit more of a watchdog in Congress, keeping an eye on the executive branch actions than we do, certainly, if Democrats are in control of those House committees. So that would be another benefit for Republicans taking control of the House, even, narrowly for gun owners, because I do think that if we see a split Congress, then all of a sudden the executive branch becomes the go-to place over the next 2 years for the gun control movement. Whenever they want to get something done in D.C., they're going to be asking Joe Biden to try to do it via regulation rather than legislation.
I will say, though, that that's what we expected to be the case when Republicans were able to get 50 seats in the Senate last time around, and we still ended up with a gun control bill because Republican senators ended up agreeing to do one. Although I don't know, do you think that House Republicans tend to be more conservative on the issue, though? And you can see that in the votes, but so maybe that's even more of a bulwark, the fact that they control. Then there's also the fact that Republicans had 50 seats, but didn't actually control the Senate. And so they didn't set the agenda. So yeah, I mean, I feel like it is a pretty good conclusion that gun control bills are even less likely now than the previous Congress.
Yeah. And again, you're right. It's never a 100%, lock solid guarantee. But I do think that it is way less likely we're going to see anti-gun legislation advance in Congress if Republicans take control of the House. And again, I think, the added oversight that would be of huge benefit. At the state level, we have seen, looks like Michigan is going to be, Democrats in complete control of state government for the first time in 40 years. I wrote a piece at Bearing Arms this week cautioning Democrats not to do what Democrats in Virginia did and think that this is some sort of mandate for gun control, because otherwise the majority is going to be really short-lived. But I'm a little concerned that is in fact what's going to happen. I believe there's a supermajority now in Vermont. So, Governor Phil Scott has vetoed some gun control legislation in the past, but the legislature may be able to override his veto depending on what type of gun bill we're talking about. I still think Democrats in Vermont will be a little bit hesitant to, go full scale gun ban, given the state's, traditional recognition of the right to keep and bear arms. But I think they are going to want to try to move in some regard. Right. On the pro-gun side, Republicans now have a 5-2 majority on the North Carolina State Supreme Court. So I'm hopeful that maybe a legal challenge to the state's permit to purchase law can find some success there. We're still waiting on a couple of seats in Nebraska, but it looks like there may be enough votes to block a filibuster in the state Senate, and that would allow for constitutional carry to pass in Nebraska next year. I think constitutional carry is going to be teed up in Florida. This is something that Governor Ron DeSantis talked about a lot this year and said he wanted to sign constitutional carry before his term was up. I guess theoretically he's got another 4 years, but I spoke with Ryan Petty yesterday, one of our Bearing Arms contributors and, obviously a Second Amendment advocate and school safety advocate there in Florida. And he thinks that constitutional carry is going to be a legislative priority in Florida this year. He also talked about repealing the bill or the law that was passed after Parkland that raised the age to purchase a firearm from 18 to 21. He suggested that that's something that he's actually going to be lobbying lawmakers to do in the next session. So, I think we will see, the traditional anti-gun states are still largely anti-gun. We've got a couple of new battleground states, and I think we've got a couple of states where it's been tough to get good bills or bad laws off the books. And I think we're going to be able to make more progress. But, by and large, I think the map still looks largely the same at the state level as it did before Election Day, with the exceptions that I mentioned.
Yeah, I think that's right. And I think a lot of people will also fall back on the idea that the Bruen decision is going to limit what can practically be done by some of these legislatures, even if they do attempt to put in new gun bans or confiscation efforts or things of that nature. And to that point, actually, maybe we should talk a little bit about the practical fallout from the Oregon initiative if it does end up passing. How do you foresee that going? I mean, a lot of people will say, well, I think FPC, Firearms Policy Coalition, is already threatening to sue if it does pass. And, the Bruen decision would imply that at least the magazine confiscation stuff is probably not constitutional. And the permit to purchase stuff is going to be highly questionable as well. But that it's going to take a while for those legal cases to happen, right? And so what should people be worried about the interim period if they live in Oregon?
Yeah, well, yeah, I think you should. There have been, to the best of my knowledge, at least 3 county sheriffs who've come out and said, we're not enforcing the magazine ban. And I'm actually in the process of contacting the other county sheriffs across the state to find out what their policies are going to be. But the sheriff in Klamath County put out an alert this week and was telling residents there, okay, like, here's how I think things are likely to go. And he noted that once this election has been certified, and let's just say that 114 is approved, 30 days after the election is certified, Measure 114 takes effect. And so the magazine ban takes effect, but so too does the permit to purchase section. And there is no permit, as the sheriff pointed out. There's no way for you to get a permit. There's no way for sheriffs to issue a permit. And it's not likely that system is going to be developed within 30 days. So what happens when this law takes effect and nobody can buy a gun in Oregon? I would like to think that would be a pretty clear enough violation of people's fundamental right to keep and bear arms that would at least stay enforcement of this law until that permit system has been written, but hopefully throughout the entirety of the legal challenge, right? Because there are fundamental rights that are implicated here. And it's not just the fact that, there's going to be a database of gun owners or the tens of millions of dollars in unfunded mandates for law enforcement, which is going to play hell with rural county sheriffs' budgets. There's a built-in 14-day waiting period because the law enforcement agencies have 14 days to issue that permit to purchase. So, if you are in fear for your life, let's say you have an abusive ex, you have a stalker, there's whatever, there is an imminent danger to your life under 114, tough cookies, right? You're not able to get access to a firearm. There are all kinds of, I think, really fundamental problems tied within Measure 114. And if the law takes effect, they're going to be readily apparent right away. And this is something, keep in mind that I don't think this was approved. I don't think this really shows that there was a mandate for 114. One of my friends in Oregon said you could call this more an act of God than the will of the people, just because of the tight margin that we're looking at here. And so if all of a sudden this law starts to be implemented and we see the chaos that is ensuing, I think there's going to be a lot of buyer's remorse, frankly, in Oregon. And the organizers of 114, a group called the Lift Every Voice Oregon, they're already planning on a gun ban for next year. They are bringing forward a ban on the sale and manufacture of so-called assault weapons that they want the legislature to pass. And they say if the legislature doesn't do it, that's going to be their next ballot initiative. But, again, depending on what happens over the next few months with the rollout, if Measure 114 is certified, I think they're going to lose a lot of face. And I think there are going to be a lot of progressives in Oregon who voted for this thinking that they were doing the right thing. And instead, they're just going to see that, people are unable to access their right to keep and bear arms entirely. Most of the arrests for the magazine ban are happening in Portland. There are no underlying violent offenses attached. And all of a sudden, this isn't going to look like the giant step forward for public safety. It's going to look like a giant step backwards for criminal justice reform and for individuals' rights.
Yeah. I mean, that's certainly the direction that would seem most likely for things to head if this does pass and get certified. But that's something I think we're absolutely going to keep top of mind here at the Reload. That's something we're going to follow closely, and I imagine it's something that you are going to follow closely as well at Bearing Arms. Can you tell people just a little bit more about how they can find more of your writing? And you also obviously have your own show that I'm a guest on occasionally. How can people find that?
Yeah, absolutely. Just go to bearingarms.com. That's BEARING. I don't know why it would be BARE, but sometimes people do type that in. So no, BEARING, arms.com. And if you want to check out the Bearing Arms Cam and Company podcast, you can find us on YouTube or Rumble or all of the major podcast platforms, from Spotify and SoundCloud to all the rest. And yeah, I always love getting a chance to talk with Stephen, whether it's on this podcast or on Cam and Company. And Stephen, thanks so much for your time, man. This is always a lot of fun.
Hey, thank you. You're the guest. I really appreciate you making time to come on and look through these results with us. I think you got a lot of really insightful stuff to say, and that if people like what we do here at the Reload, I think they'll like what you do over at Bearing Arms. You guys also get a little more into the commentary, which I think you do really well. So that's one differentiator between the two publications, and one reason why somebody might want to subscribe to both of them. So make sure you head over and check it out today. But we're going to head to our news update over with Jake Fogelman now.
All right, ladies and gentlemen, it's time for the weekly news update. I'm contributing writer Jake Fogelman, joined as always by Reload founder Steve Gutowski.
Did you forget who you were for a second?
Election week has just fried my brain. Not all cylinders are firing, clearly.
Yeah, same here. We still don't have all the results. It's Friday when we're recording this, and some of these states need to reform their system so we can get these results a little faster. It's honestly ridiculous, but nothing new either, unfortunately. It's how it's been for a lot of these states for a long time. But yeah, that's what we talked about with Cam this week. So we got a little bit of additional gun news. That's not just about the election. The election was the big thing this week, of course, and it's going to matter a lot. And we're going to talk a lot more about it moving forward. I think you're going to have another members piece this week, which will go live the same time as this recording is released to our members who get the podcast a day early, of course, if anyone who wasn't aware. But yeah, we have some other news to talk about first, right?
Yeah, we had a big court decision in the ongoing saga of the New York gun carry regime. That's seems like, every few weeks there's more big news. But you wrote a piece about actually a pretty major ruling in the case where a injunction was finally issued. If you want to tell us a little bit about, what happened there.
Yeah, that's right. The Northern District case. This was Judge Sotheby, who we've talked about a number of times in the past, because that case has been particularly interesting in this whole fight over New York's new gun carry law, their response to the Supreme Court striking down their old gun carry law. And now, of course, it's been preliminary and it's been enjoined. There's a preliminary injunction issued against the law by Judge Sotheby, which blocks most of the controversial provisions, not every single one, but it does block the vast majority of them. For instance, a lot of the requirements attached to obtaining a permit were enjoined. So you don't have to give the information, your family members' information to the police, which was a requirement. You don't have to turn over your social media accounts. You don't have to prove that you have a good moral character, or at least the state can't deny you a permit based on their subjective judgment that you don't have a good moral character, because he found that was basically identical to the good reason clause that the Supreme Court struck down in their ruling in New York State Rifle and Pistol Association v. Bruin. So the bunch of the requirements for how you obtain a permit are now blocked. And then he blocked a number of the sensitive places restrictions that the state tried to put in place. So, for instance, it's a pretty long list because New York had kind of tried to ban gun carry almost everywhere in the state, right? But he blocked the ones that pertain to restaurants that serve alcohol. So this is even if you're not drinking any alcohol, they barred you from carrying in a restaurant that serves alcohol, which actually is not a completely unique provision for New York. That one, this might actually have some relevance in other states where they have that same policy. Some states do prevent you from going into. There's a couple different approaches to that. Like Virginia, where I am, you can carry in a place that serves alcohol. You just can't drink alcohol, obviously, while you're carrying. But there are states that have this same policy, and then there's some that have a policy against carrying in places where their revenue is more than 50% from alcohol, which is meant to obviously target like bars and things. So it'll be interesting to see if that spreads to other restrictions in other states that have less restrictive gun laws. But there was a provision against carrying in a theater, at protests, places of worship. Even if places of worship was a total ban, even if the church or synagogue wanted to allow you to carry, you couldn't. Banquet halls, conference centers, parks, areas at airports or clinics that are before security. A lot of states will allow you to carry up to the security area at an airport if you have a permit. Again, these are all things that apply to people who have permits, who've gone through the process to get a permit. They still would have been off limits in places like this. And then also public buses. However, and one of the bigger ones, one of the ones with the most consequential implications was this provision that blocked people from, by default, from carrying on private property, even at businesses that are open to the public. So it kind of flipped everything on its head as far as the way most states handle this, because in every other state, essentially, you can carry as long as there is not a sign posted that says you can't carry. But New York made it so that you cannot carry anywhere unless there's a sign posted that says you can carry. And Sotheby struck that one down as well. He did uphold a number of provisions, or at least not block a number of provisions, even some that he had previously blocked. So the entire area of Times Square being off limits to
loosely
gun carry.
defined area.
This vague, like they made Times Square this giant section around the intersection that everybody knows as Times Square off limits, and this injunction doesn't block that. Same for the subway, even though it blocks the gun-free zone on public buses, it doesn't do so for the subway system. And these largely came down to lack of standing. Sotheby's been a real stickler for standing. And so he determined in this ruling that the plaintiffs didn't have standing for a couple of these things. He actually had a couple footnotes in those areas where he essentially said he would block these provisions if the plaintiffs could prove standing. So essentially, it seems like they probably have to bring another lawsuit for each of those other provisions, the couple that are left over after this. So, ultimately, it's a pretty big win for gun rights advocates. This was a case from Gun Owners of America. And they've had a long go of it because initially Sotheby tossed their first lawsuit altogether over lack of standing because he didn't like the way that they had pleaded it and how their plaintiffs had given answers in questioning. So they had to refile the case, and then they went through the temporary restraining order, which they got but was stayed. And then now they got this preliminary injunction, which is not stayed. That's another key point. This went into effect immediately, and New York has been barred from enforcing these things, at least until perhaps the Second Circuit intervenes and they file an appeal.
Right. And I have seen New York has since filed the notice of appeal with the Second Circuit in this case. But like you said, the key difference here is this time Sotheby said this is not stayed pending appeal. So this injunction will take effect. So that's a bigger win for, I think, gun rights advocates in New York, because as you pointed out with the last TRO, he delayed it 3 days and then New York immediately appealed. And then the Second Circuit put another stay on it without actually addressing the appeal. And it's just been sort of hanging in limbo. So not much of a emergency relief order there if it's just going to be stayed while judges sit on it for a while. But as you pointed out, big difference here. The injunction actually goes into effect and it will stay in effect until otherwise noted by an appeals court.
And you would expect that the Second Circuit will put a stay on it
probably
and accept this case at some point here in the near future. So, that's something to keep in mind. This isn't the fight's not over here for either side. The Attorney General gave us comment for the story, just said that they're looking at their options for moving forward, and there's no reason to think that they're not going to fight this up at the Second Circuit. Although I feel even if they win in the Second Circuit, it'd be hard for me to imagine the Supreme Court not taking this case, because it directly contradicts what they ruled in Bruin.
Right.
So I think they'd be pretty eager to step in and do something if this law did make it through scrutiny at the Second Circuit, which we'll certainly be watching for and reporting on for all of you guys. But there's another question at play here when it comes to the stay and enforcement of this injunction. And that has to do with New York City which is in the Southern District in New York. So this is a case in the Northern District. Then there's a case in the Western District, which also, which dealt specifically with the places of worship prohibition. I believe that's a Second Amendment Foundation case. And the judge there put a temporary restraining order in place, basically immediately. And so New York, with no stay, which means New York's been enjoined from enforcing that part of the provision. But New York has taken a very specific approach to these rulings and is really only abiding by them in the specific districts where they've been issued. So the Southern District of New York, where there is also a lawsuit against the places of worship prohibition that's filed by a Jewish group down there, they have been enforcing this law despite those other orders from the Northern and Western District. And so the Southern District judge he denied a temporary restraining order request and hasn't moved very quickly on the preliminary injunction hearing. So that one is still in limbo and it's still not clear. And the Attorney General's office did not answer my question when I asked whether they would continue to enforce this law outside of the Northern District. But in court, they've argued that they're entitled to do that. So this ruling may not have an effect on the entirety of New York State.
Yeah.
So we'll have to see.
I think that's an important thing to bring up for gun rights advocates who are, I think, getting probably rightly so excited about what the Bruin decision means for legal challenges to gun laws, because they see a lot of temporary restraining orders being issued, sometimes preliminary injunctions being issued. But this strategy, I think, demonstrates a way that governments who want to do everything in their power to uphold these laws can create several roadblocks. Even if you're successful in one court, they'll literally carve up districts of the state where we say, okay, it was struck down in this district, but we're going to continue to enforce it in a different district where there's also litigation pending. And it just so happens that that district is the most populous area of the state. So it affects the most people. New York City's in that district there. So even things that are victories in court, like an injunction, isn't so much a victory for the rest of the state.
Yeah, certainly they're going to take a maximalist approach to opposing these rulings and trying to enforce their laws. At least that seems to be what they're doing now. And frankly, they're getting some help from some of these judges, because the Southern District judge, he appears to be dragging his feet on all of this. Seems as though he doesn't want to enjoin this law, regardless of what these other two judges have done. And he also doesn't want to move quickly so that the plaintiffs can appeal his decisions. That's at least what the plaintiffs are claiming in that Southern District case. They sent a letter. We wrote about this last week, but they sent a letter to the judge after the FBI had issued a warning against Jewish worshipers in New Jersey, just across the river from where a lot of these plaintiffs live and worship, about anti-Semitic threats that had come to the FBI's attention and were considered to be very credible. And, so they were urging the judge to act so that they could carry firearms legally with, licensed into their synagogues to protect themselves in case of an attack, which obviously there has been quite a lot of anti-Semitic violence in New York City over the last couple of years. It's an ongoing problem for the city, and it's only gotten worse in the last couple of years. And you've seen the rise of, obviously, anti-Semitic statements from celebrities like Kanye West and Kyrie Irving. And so, it's obvious why these plaintiffs have a concern for their safety, an immediate concern. And it's unfortunate to see what amount to delaying tactics from the Southern District judge. It's not something unexpected, though, is what I would say. Like you're talking about here, there are other ways to oppose Supreme Court edicts rather than just ignoring them or flouting them, like going directly in contradiction to what they've ordered. I mean, New York is doing that with their law,
I was going to say.
certainly. But the sort of savvier way of trying to mitigate what the effects of Bruin are going to be is this delaying tactic or minimization in rulings, or, you can rule that as applied, this law is unconstitutional, but that not rule on whether the law itself is unconstitutional. There's a lot of ways you can stretch out hearings, stretch out cases. I mean, this is what you're seeing in the Southern District, right?
Yeah.
The Southern District case was filed before the Western District case, but the Western District case already got to a temporary restraining order being issued and a preliminary injunction hearing happening before either of those things happen in the Southern District case. And the Southern District judge is asking for all sorts of additional witness testimony. And there's a whole list of complaints that the plaintiffs have about how the proceedings have gone. But, I think their ultimate complaint is that he's sort of slow walking this lawsuit, which seems to be fairly legitimate complaint based on how the other federal judges have handled almost identical cases. And in fact, the Sotheby case is a much more intensive case. That ruling is 184 pages long, right, because it deals with almost the entirety of that law, not just the places of worship prohibition. So he moved that case along faster than the Southern District judge has, and he had a lot more to deal with. So, this is a really good example, I think, of that tactic of delay and minimization that you're likely to see other courts who maybe don't like the Bruin ruling undertake. Although, I will say I expected more of this than what we've gotten so far, because there have been a number of, Obama and Biden appointee federal judges who have even Bush appointees or whatever who've vocally talked about how they don't like the Bruin ruling, but they've nonetheless abided by it, and they haven't tried to really, put in these delaying tactics or use minimization in their rulings to avoid the inevitable conclusion that Bruin would have to withdraw in the case. So it's a little rarer than what I've was expecting, but I think it's clearly happening in this situation here.
Sure. Like you said, we're also going to have to see how the appeals court decides to handle it. I think that'll be a big tell as well. So, and of course, one of the only places you can do that is the reload, where we're going to be staying on top of that.
Absolutely. And, we actually have seen this a little bit from the appeals courts out in the Ninth Circuit already, because they sent some of those cases that got GVR granted, vacated, and remanded by the Supreme Court have been sent back down to, the lower court judges that had already found the laws unconstitutional, just to sort of redo the case again. And you're going to get the same basic ruling, but it'll take a while. And so that's probably another example of this delay tactic. Yeah. But like you said, it's something we are going to keep on top of. And if you want to follow along, you can head over to thereload.com, sign up for our free newsletter. We won't flood your inbox with a bunch of meaningless emails. You get one email from the free newsletter every Friday. It'll give you what's going on with guns in America from a sober, serious point of view. And then if you want a little more, if you want to go in depth, if you want more analysis of what's happening, you can buy a membership and you'll get exclusive access to hundreds of pieces of analysis and even exclusive stories that you won't find anywhere else. And you'll be helping support the publication, because we rely 100% on the funding of our members to make this all possible. You'll also get access to this podcast a day early and the opportunity to appear on the show in a member segment. If you're already a member and you want to come on the show, just reply to your Sunday members newsletter, and we'd love to have you on and hear from you. Always one of my favorite segments. But that's all we've got for this week. So we will see you guys again next week.